Welcome to this lecture entitled Shared Authority and Contested History. Who owns history? We want to talk today about the difficulties in sharing authority. The 20th century project of creating a profession out of history was an endeavor to get paid for knowledge work. Consequently, historians as a group had to convince people with resources that historical knowledge existed in discrete silos. That is, history was its own discipline. That knowledge belonged to experts. That knowledge could only be passed along via formal education, and that such knowledge was socially useful and socially important. Once resource providers accepted those things, then historians were able to create a body of arcane knowledge that they could get paid for transmitting to people like students. This erected layers of infrastructure that rely on experts controlling knowledge. That is, schools, management in business, reliance on engineering and technology, not in the discipline of history, but in society itself. We erected these layers of infrastructure. We relied on this kind of expertise throughout the 20th century. Over time, this expertise became its own end, conferring status and income, but particularly conferring power. In its essence, professionalization and this idea of expertise is elitist and anti-democratic. On the other hand, it is also open to everyone who is willing to make the effort to do the work. It's not as open as it ought to be, but we have made amazing strides throughout the 20th century in making knowledge and expertise, whether it's in all fields or one or two fields per person, much more available than it has ever been in the past. Now, for the expert, there is a danger in sharing the authority that came with power, beyond that of just reducing status and power. In fact, most intellectual experts, that is, people who live in the life of the mind and who labor in the life of the mind, are very concerned that sharing authority will reduce the rigor of the discipline, particularly the intellectual rigor of the discipline, and that sharing authority allows intentional bias to creep into the account of the past. David Lowenthal mentions or discusses some of these problems. Memory problems is the first one that he discusses. False memory syndrome is something he says is people convincing themselves of a version of the past that is not accurate and not reliable. Oral historians have run into this on a regular basis. There's another issue that Lowenthal brings up, and that is the regular problems of selective retention or forgetfulness. This is in addition to his discussion of heritage activism and the sharing of historical authority over the knowledge about the past with people who discuss heritage, people who deal with heritage rather than with history. So let's talk now about the difference in history, according to David Lowenthal, and heritage, again according to David Lowenthal in his book, Possessed by the Past. To Lowenthal, there is a difference between history and heritage. History is a critical examination of the past based on evidence, and it argues for a type of truth that exists outside of the self-interest of the historian, him or herself. The historical method is discipline specific, We agree on what constitutes correct method in our search for the truth. Now, that agreement is kind of loose, broad, allows other forms of truth seeking to come in, evidence gathering, question asking to come into the canon, but in general, we have to, as historians, determine that some ways of looking for truth are correct for us and other ways of seeking truth are not correct for us. That is, the historical method is discipline specific. It relies on constructing arguments. These arguments privilege reason, logic, and empiricism over emotions and bias. And historical method grew, as did many other methods, from the 17th century scientific revolutions, as filtered through the 18th century Enlightenment, and added to and shaped dramatically by the 19th century philosophy of positivism. Now, what then is proper historical argument? First, we have to look at the construction of an argument, the wireframing, you might say, of what an argument in history is supposed to look like. That is, we put forth a claim, we make assertions about that claim, and we provide evidence to support the assertions that argue for the claim. What then is a claim? A claim is an overarching statement that explains the meaning of the accumulated evidence. You often start out with a claim, but you start out with a claim as an hypothesis that you're going to test. It becomes an interpretation of evidence later in the process. Part of that process is the insertion of assertions. These are subclaims that must be true for the claim to be true. Assertions also serve to organize and give meaning to parts of the body of evidence. Now, what is evidence? Evidence is data that supports the interpretive claim. The characteristics of solid evidence include that the sources are reliable, that the information we call evidence comes from multiple sources that do not rely on each other. The information comports with information and evidence from other sources. We test the evidence for bias, agenda, and self-interest. This whole process of gathering and using evidence privileges an empirical worldview. That is, if we can perceive something through our senses, and it survives the tests of reliability and validity, then we consider it to be evidence. This doesn't mean that evidence either is evidence or is not evidence. Sometimes there is better evidence and less good evidence. But this does preclude many kinds of evidence. For example, it precludes faith-based evidence. It precludes paranormal evidence. If we cannot perceive it through our senses, it does not rise to consideration as evidence at all. This is not in life. This is in historical method. Historical method also has to account for contrary evidence, and in fact welcomes contrary evidence, incorporates contrary evidence, and more often than not either argues away the contrary evidence or uses the contrary evidence to modify the hypothesis in the process of the hypothesis, the claim, becoming an interpretation. And finally, doubt and revision always prevail. They are always welcome. Whenever you hear somebody yelling about those danged revisionists, you know that they're not an historian. The practice of the discipline of history is all about revision. But what is heritage? Heritage is an enterprise by which a community uses events in the past to construct a present collective identity. Lowenthal does not denigrate heritage, but notes that it is a fundamentally different activity than is the practice of history. He claims heritage is not bad history, it's simply not history at all. Let's look now at the heritage method, just like we looked at the historical method. Heritage method seeks to create powerful myths, usually origin stories. It is not a critical examination of past events. Source reliability is not tested outside of the content's appeal to the community or to the person who's doing the communication. Heritage method does not privilege empirical evidence, nor does it necessarily employ linear arguments. It does not admit contrary evidence, and it does not privilege doubt or revision. In fact, faith in the myth itself denotes membership in the shared community, and acceptance by that community and by its members of the myth is based on a powerful emotional desire to belong. The value of the myth is in the comfort it brings to the community members in some kind of fight that they individually or collectively are having with current concerns. So the question is, how do historians, public historians, share authority with a public who does not share the discipline's characteristics, definitions, and methods? Shared authority is allowing community members access to get their stories into the quote-unquote historical canon. Public historians usually negotiate between the stories provided by the community and the demands of the discipline, accepting as Holy Writ neither one nor the other. Public historians have to realize that histories serve many legitimate purposes. The question then that we must ponder is a long-term question of theory. What ethical guidelines allow us to account for and incorporate good history from below? And it's a short-term question of technique. How do I do this in the next few minutes? I hope that your readings this week will begin to answer some of these questions. And as always, thank you very much for your attention.